Welcome to CoLab Radio. This is a publication of the Community Innovators Lab at the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning. This is the episode in the Decolonizing Science series, which has focused on how colonial legacies shape the practice and study of science today. Previous episodes have explored the role of science in anti-colonial movements, effort to coordinate between scientists in post-colonial contexts, as well as how social context shapes the practice of science. We have also delved into the field of science and technology studies to consider the role of academia in decolonizing science. You can find these episodes and more at colab.mit.edu/CoLab Radio. But today we are excited to add one more episode about the practice of science in different African cities, and specifically in efforts to recenter the work of community scientists. So I'll hand it off to Priyanka deSouza, who has been the real, the brains behind this whole operation, to tell us a little bit more about the panel and today's conversation. Priyanka?
Thank you so much, Emmett. So we have a great panel today. We're so grateful that they've given us their time. So first we have Rebecca Garland. Professor Garland is a principal researcher at the Council for Science and Industrial Research, CSIR, in South Africa. Then we have Kofi Amegah. Kofi is senior lecturer of epidemiology and biostatistics with tremendous expertise in nutritional and air pollution exposure assessment. Then we're lucky to have Constant Cap. Constant is the Senior Product Manager at Code for Africa's Africa.Sensor's Environmental Monitoring Program. And then we have Noémi Tousignant. Noémi is Lecturer in Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Thank you all so much for being here. Our first question is, can you tell us about your work on air pollution / exposure science / toxicology? Where do you do your research? And what, according to you, is the role and or relevance of science in framing and addressing the issue of pollution in the policy context in which you work? Rebecca, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure, thank you for that introduction and thank you for inviting me on this. So a lot of my background was already, you already mentioned it. I work at the CSIR, which is a national lab in South Africa. And part of our mandate is actually to use science to improve the lives of South Africans. And so we take that very seriously with our air quality work as well. So I work both in air quality and in climate change work. For my air quality work, I mostly focus on South Africa. And as you mentioned, we do a lot of things with air quality modeling, with emissions as well, really very technical space, as well as for the linkages between climate change and air quality. But all of this is very collaborative as well with the community within South Africa. We're also starting to be interested in how to use different streams of data to understand the air quality problem, as well as biosphere and atmosphere interactions, so pollen and such. And we've started with a collaboration here, some measurements of that. So different aspects of air quality, all trying to understand its impacts and really to improve it. You know, I've said the goal of my work is whenever a decision is made that impacts air quality, that air quality information should be on the table. Obviously, policymakers have a lot of different things to consider, but I think very often air quality isn't even in there. We don't have the quantitative information on that. And I think that's, you asked about the role of science. And I think for really across Africa, that is the first goal, I would say, of science is to help understand and the realization of how large the problem is. I think in South Africa, even we have monitoring and such, we have laws, but the scale of the problem, I don't think is understood. And I don't think that it's really as much of a priority as I think it should be. And I think that's true across the continent. Air quality in Africa is generally not seen as a priority. And I really think it needs to be. And I think also the role for science is to help to understand how effectively, the most effective ways to improve pollution. I think it's a large problem and I think it's urgent that we fix it. We don't have a lot of time nor financial or capacity resources, you know, to waste with trial and error. We need to understand what are the most effective policies and interventions we can do to improve air quality. And I think science has a really large role there in helping to quantify that. And then you did mention at the end as well, the role for science of bringing people together through ANGA, which is the new growing Pan-African network for atmospheric scientists across Africa to try to bring us all together, but then also through publishing the work and getting the knowledge out there through the Clean Air Journal.
Thank you. As you know, I'm a huge fan of the Clean Air Journal and all of the work that you do with ANGA. Kofi, do you mind responding next?
Well, again, let me thank you for inviting me to be part of this initiative. I'm really excited and I'm privileged. Basically, what I do, you already said, I'm based at the University of Cape Coast here in Ghana, which is a public university. And we have a mandate to teach and do research to inform policy. And I have a small public health research group at my department here. And our focus is on nutrition, which emanates from my background. My training is in nutrition. And then also air pollution. I have a PhD in environmental epidemiology. So I try to marry the two. It's not easy doing nutrition work and doing environmental health work, trying to stay at the cutting edge of both disciplines. In recent times, what we've been trying to do is that we've been trying to veer into what we call environmental nutrition, where we try to look at how air pollution impacts health outcomes. How can nutrition ameliorate the effect of air pollution on health outcomes? That is also very crucial. So in brief, that is what we do here. And our research mainstay, as I've already indicated, is about trying to assess nutritional exposures, trying to assess air pollution exposures, and then look at the interaction of the two and how they impact maternal health outcomes, how they also impact cardiovascular health outcomes. Because, for example, for cardiovascular health outcomes, is growing on our continent. I mean, incidence is growing on our continent due to so many reasons, nutritional issues and also environmental issues, which the data is lacking. What is the role of science? I'm excited that Rebecca has started this off by saying air pollution is not a problem. It's not viewed as a problem in Africa. That is very true. Air pollution is not a problem. And there are so many reasons why air pollution is not a problem. And anytime I've sat on any panel, I don't hesitate to put it across that if you find yourself in a continent where malaria is a big problem, where we don't have access to clean drinking water, what will be the government's priority? HIV is also killing us. Of course, the priority is to address malaria. The priority is to address HIV/AIDS. The priority is to send clean drinking water to the folks in the village, because ultimately that is what wins the government elections. It's not about addressing air pollution. And the reason why it's not at the forefront of policy discussions is because there is no data. Africa is bereft of air pollution data. There is no air pollution data. In South Africa has one of the most advanced air quality monitoring systems in Africa, but even there they have challenges. In Ghana here, I find myself, all the air quality monitoring, air quality monitors are based in the capital city. And how many do we have? It's only in recent times that donors, World Bank is trying to support us and show up the monitoring system, which for me is terrible, because government can invest in air quality, in air quality, and improve population health, but they don't have the data. We are not resourced, and we, the researchers here, we are not resourced. We are not able to compete with people in the global north, for funding to do air pollution epidemiological research. And that is the only way you can go to government and tell government that air pollution is a problem. You need to act. Because if you don't have, the argument has also been that, and I read a paper recently that there's so much information on air pollution health effects that has been conducted in Europe, has been conducted in North America. So why can we not act in Africa? We can't act in Africa with that data. We need local evidence to show governments. It's not all too cool to go to government and tell government that air pollution is the leading cause of cardiovascular diseases in North America. So by inference, is also the leading cause for cardiovascular diseases in Africa, so we should act. No, it doesn't act. So in all these things, science has a role to play. Science is what is going to inform policy. Science is what is going to guide the questions that we need to ask, so that we'll be able to do proper research. And if we're able to show some scientific evidence, then of course we are going to stimulate policy action, and it's going to lead to improvements in population health. So I think that is what my initial submission. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Noémi, we'd love to hear your response.
Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you so much again, like the others. Thanks for inviting me. And it's wonderful to not just have a chance to sort of bring my own perspective, but to get to meet the other people on the panel and to hear what they have to say. Really fantastic opportunity. So I wanted to maybe start before I say what I've worked on specifically, just say a little bit more about the fields that I come from and that I work in and what they have to maybe contribute to the conversation. So first, science and technology studies, which I think Emmett described really well, but I'll just repeat a couple words, is really studies science and technology as forms of social and political practice. So not, science on one side and society on the other, which may or may not interact, but science really is one among other ways of understanding and acting on the world. And one of the questions that colleagues in this field have asked about exposure science is how, despite or because of science and science-based regulation, we still have pollution and exposure, how they're sort of allowed to persist, to be kept in doubt, to often being kept outside of what is known and what's made perceptible and actionable. And I think this speaks a little bit to the relations between science and policy, but also what kind of knowledge gets produced in the first instance. And these questions also about whose knowledge counts and what's made knowable are also central to colonial history and post-colonial studies, which sort of examines how the global South has both contributed to, but also been sidelined by the emergence of kind of Euro-American modernity, which includes science and capitalism. And finally, a little bit about sort of critical medical anthropology or critical health studies, which examines how ill health arises through social and political relations, which are including relations with toxins, particulates, microbes, but also through conditions of labor and living more generally, and the ways in which people are included, excluded, recognized, or not. So those are also important to understanding how people experience toxic or polluted environments as part of broader histories of kind of making do and suffering. And I think that's also really important to understanding exposure in Africa. And there's more and more work on this, which is really something I'm very optimistic about. So coming back to my own work, sort of in about 5 to 10 years ago, so it's work that I've sort of not doing actively now, I researched and wrote about toxicological science in Senegal from a historical and anthropological point of view. And what I argued is that if you want to understand and act on global inequalities in exposure, in sort of experiences of pollution, you also have to pay attention to what scientists in the global South and Africa are doing, and also what they wish they could do. How, like, what they're doing is, and how they can imagine what they could do is constrained by inequalities in access to funding and equipment, but also deciding what kind of knowledge is important and how to do it. So I also sort of argue that how they, and sort of we with them, and they includes we, the people participating in this panel, might imagine exposure science beyond these constraints. So how we can look at not just incremental, but sort of dream about what a really sovereign kind of African exposure science might look like. And so just to say, finally, when I was writing this, I felt I was really walking a thin line between celebrating the efforts of Senegalese toxicologists and other science and Africans to exercise capacity, and also showing that it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for protecting most Africans' health and their environments, but also not enough for them as scientists to do what they think they should and could be doing, sort of fulfilling their mandate as public scientists.
Thank you. Constance, do you mind responding?
my initial interest in this came while organizing some tweet chats through Neapolitans, and one of our tweet chats was under the topic of air pollution in Nairobi. And we started, in order to organize the tweet chat, of course, I had to do a bit of research and find out, what information is there about air quality. It was mainly air quality, in the city. Coming from an urban planning background, I found it quite interesting and got to understand, how big the challenges are within this particular sector and how big planning has a role to play within this in this particular sector. Because when you try to understand air, when you look at ambient air quality, you're mainly talking about, land use management, better land use management and better urban mobility. When you're talking about, household air quality, you're also going into land use management, but also the anthropology and sociology side of it. So as an urban planner, that interest began. At the moment, I'm with Code for Africa, as was mentioned, and we deploy sensors in different African cities. We're currently working on household air pollution engagement with the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which is going to be the first time that they actually go into this particular field to try to collect data, more specific household data on that area. And then we've also had other engagements. I think, Priyanka, you are part of Placemaking Nairobi, where you go to analyze and collect and analyze some data on air quality when we closed some streets in the city. And what I found interesting, during that engagement was, even before looking at the data, which I got to see almost many years later, but was the perceptions that the people had, from shop owners, street users, and they all talked about how there was better business, how the environment was cleaner, how, they basically felt, more at home when we had done temporary street closures. So of course, the role of science comes in, in sharing this particular data and information, and working in collaboration with other sectors in order to bring out these stories on the importance and the facts behind the matter of air pollution.
Thank you, Constant. What does decolonizing pollution research or toxicology mean to you? What work does it entail? And how can studies done by researchers such as yourselves, who live, work in, and know the context in which you work, be recentered? Kofi, could we start with you this time?
Yeah. So what I said is a very big topic, and but what it means to me, if you say we are decolonizing air pollution research, then it means Africans need to lead African air pollution research. Simply put, Africans have to lead air pollution research. So what do we need to be effective? We need capacity building. We need the resources, because there's a lot of intellect on the continent. So once we are provided with resources, then of course we'll be very effective. We'll be able to investigate the environmental health or air pollution issues that afflict us, and then try and impact policy for population health gains. But you see, we also need to be very careful not to decolonize entirely. Collaboration is very important. Now we are talking about collaborative research. So we need folks in the global north to come around, join forces with us, and then also bring their expertise on board so that we can do very impactful air pollution research that can impact policy and then lead to some public health gains. So that is what I understand by it. So of course, if you have researchers in Africa, they know the terrain, they know the right questions to ask. That is very important for improving population health. So I think recently on Twitter, there was some confusion where there was a paper that was published on Indian data, and there were no Indians on that paper. And I think it's unfortunate, you know, and I think the lead author was trying to fight off people that were pointing accusing fingers. Yeah. But I think the concerns were very genuine, because how well do you know the terrain? How well do you know the socioeconomic conditions of the environment to be able to link it up with the findings of the study? So all these things are very, very key. So in summary, what I'm just trying to say is that we should be leading research here. But again, it's also very important that we have some collaborations so that we'll be able to shape whatever we do so that it can be very impactful for the populations that we are hoping to serve. Yeah.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Kofi did a great job in summarizing that. I agree with what he said. I think for me, this was a very hard question as well. It's such a complex question. So when I started thinking of it, also I thought, well, there's an inward view for me and an outward view. And the inward view is within South Africa. So I think decolonizing within South Africa is ensuring active participation across stakeholders and different viewpoints and different views. And we do have a very participatory government in South Africa, from the regulatory planning type of thing. There's a lot of public meetings and things like that. Whether that is true active participation, I think, is a different question. And I think that there are ways that that can definitely be improved, but at least much more so than, for example, growing up in the US, I feel it's a much stronger ethos of a participatory government, which I think is a helpful place to start from. I also think with scientists, of course, there's more need to get some more of the more qualitative information, and I'm a scientist, so that's how I break it up, of course, but the experiential and that information on the drivers, on the causes of pollution. And that's one place that I really struggle with. I'm a chemist. I think quantitatively, but this is of course where collaborations come in, and it's a multidisciplinary, and we do need anthropologists working in this field along with us, not just the natural scientists, social scientists, and NGOs and across the different types of stakeholders. So that was one way I was thinking decolonizing is really getting all the viewpoints, all the different voices, all the different viewpoints in the thought processes and approaches. And then when I was thinking outwardly, and this one is hard, I think. So this is, I think, I experience much more day to day. And for the longest time, I didn't have really words to say what I was experiencing. So I'm probably not going to say it terribly eloquently now. But I mean, I've worked in labs in the US and in Germany, and I've worked in field missions in other continents. I've been now in South Africa over 10 years. But the African research, so the outwardly is interacting with the international community. African research is not considered as interesting and is treated differently, I feel, in the international research community than any other place I've worked before. And the reception that it gets is, and it's not just my research, it's not that like I'm a bad researcher, so my research isn't deemed important, but it's, it's systematically, you start hearing about this, it's not important to the international community. We might not have the fancy equipment, but this is still very important work. And it never existed in my other relationship, when I was at other labs elsewhere, even working on air quality in other non-European and US places. So I kind of think that there's a lot to the decolonization probably of the atmospheric science field even, but I feel like that is the first step. And unfortunately, I think we're in the first step, that our research, it might not be fancy, we try to be, but it is still good. And it is still of interest internationally. And it still is just as important and should be published. And we should, also be part of the community.
I agree with I think I just want to build on, sort of repeat and emphasize and build on what both Kofi and Rebecca have said. I think, Rebecca, what you're saying is so fascinating. And it speaks to the fact that it's not just about sort of building capacity, but about examining hierarchies of value and what is considered to be worthy knowledge, and in relation to what that knowledge is doing, what its destinations are. I think capacity building is really important, but I think we also need to sort of think about capacity as not just technical and material, but also as political. So it's a form of power, really, to decide and produce the kind of knowledge that will become part of action and debate. So it's fundamental, really, to, again, sort of recentering on science on sort of broader range of perspectives, again, like Rebecca said, both internationally, but also within countries, in terms of involving different kinds of stakeholders, for lack of a better word. And, it's not just about kind of giving grants and equipment, but finding ways of critically examining these kind of hierarchies and distributions of means, so that we allow a maximum number of people to decide what capacity is, what kind of capacity is needed, and how it should be used. So I think, often in capacity building initiatives and collaborations, there are very subtle ways in which these kind of rankings of value and sort of obstacles to full equal sovereign participation happen. So I think also we need the kind of work that sort of my colleagues do as well to examine those. So that's sort of my first sort of, for me, there are at least three ways in which I'm going to talk about decolonizing science. So one is around capacity and hierarchy. Another one is sort of paying attention to longer histories of environmental transformation and social differentiation, which are marked by colonial legacies. So the actual colonial history of living in African environments. An example of that I want to give is, I'm an expert in air pollution, but I was really struck how, Saharan dust is really a major source of particulates, and it's often defined as natural, but actually sort of long-term changes in how land is used, which include kind of colonial cash cropping policies, which led to deforestation, which lead to migration, uses of water sources. I mean, there are a lot of things that really have been barely, I feel, examined in terms of how environments are transformed and for what kind of political and economic purposes, which have an impact on how all kinds of particulates are released into the air. And then when that kind of dust comes to a city like Dakar, the way it combines with pollution from forms of combustion, motor transport, cooking, industry, gets kind of distributed among the inhabitants of the cities in ways that's affected by how the city was designed as a colonial city and how people move around it and how social differences kind of persist and are reproduced over time. So I came across actually a fascinating project by doctoral students at the University of Virginia, Angelique de Matillo and Dallas Tapman. One's an anthropologist and the other kind of atmospheric pollution scientist, so who were looking exactly these kind of questions. And finally, sort of paying attention to more diverse ways of knowing and acting on exposure environmental history. So example here that I want to give is the town of Bargny, which is near Dakar, which is incidentally where my husband is from, where a group has been really active in protesting a coal energy plant. And their contribution, I want to say, is not limited to just demanding data on air quality, which hasn't been sort of as extensive and transparent as many people feel it should be, but they also help us understand how the plant emissions coexist and act in synergy with Saharan dust, with the emissions from a nearby cement factory. There's coastal erosion, declining fish stocks, land availability, changes in soil fertility, road traffic, the government's kind of approach to economic emergence and growth. So they're, in knowing their own kind of social history, they know how these things are, these different sort of threats to their environment are interacting. And they're also, the best place to identify who's most vulnerable to these combined forms of exposure. So, something that's becoming much more part of mainstream debate with coronavirus and COVID. It's not just about sort of figuring out what the kind of overarching threat is, but how it's distributed and how we can make sure that the most exposed are also protected by the kind of regulation policies that we're going to roll out.
Thank you. Constant, we'd love to hear your response.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I mean, when you hear the word decolonizing pollution or research and toxicology, the first thing you think about here, at least the first thing that crosses my mind here in Kenya, is the fact that we have so many gaps in the system. The most interesting one, I think, that Priyanka has mentioned in her writing before is how the metropolitan the meteorological department owns a van to collect air pollution information, but they do not own the data. And a different department, which is the National Environment Management Authority, is supposed to purchase the data if they want to. And this data is supposed to be purchased from the South African, I think a South African company that owns the data. So when you look at it from that point, when that crosses your mind, you realize, that we really do not have control of what we have, of what is critical for us. Yet this is very important information for people's health, for people's day-to-day activities, for I mentioned, 19 million people reporting to hospitals with, respiratory related illnesses, and yet we do not have access to that, critical data. Other important things that also you may say stem from the so-called, pre-colonial legacy, or you may say just bad culture, includes now access to information that is available to the common person. And this, unfortunately, in this part of the world is very common. Okay, I mean, I come from an urban planning perspective, and one of the most difficult things to get from the city is simply, the development control measures. Okay, so what measures are you taking against development control? And the city, or even outside the city, the counties close to the city, what you would call maybe municipalities close to the city, will not share that information with the public. And yet it's extremely important, for the well-being and livelihoods of the people. The other thing is how understandable is the available data. Okay? Does the common person understand what he's reading when you tell him, particulate matter here is dangerous, or here, the nitrogen dioxides or sulfur dioxides are dangerous, etc., etc. Does that common person understand it? How much have we integrated issues to do with air pollution in our education system, or is it still looked upon as a high-level aspect that only when somebody starts falling sick that we realize, oh, this is that we have something that's actually dangerous? And then from that data, how is it influencing planning, action, action, policy, and planning? Okay, we recently, as Code for Africa, had a story on the media where we work a lot with journalists, and put a story of a neighborhood who are located right next to a factory. Okay, and we were able to help this neighborhood collect data on the toxins that are coming from that factory. And it's unfortunate that there are children in that neighborhood who have lost their lives. You may access that, the video is there on YouTube. But the question I asked myself from a planning perspective is, okay, who allocated this land use? A factory right next to a residential neighborhood. Clearly there's something that's wrong. One came after the other, and whoever came, at one point, that was an illegality, and probably the information on the land use of the area was hidden from the developers so that somebody could make a quick fix out of it, and it ends up having such a negative influence. So when I hear this aspect of decolonizing pollution matters, and I think of it more from a perspective of how much can we create access to information so that people know what are the dangers, what should be located, what kind of industry should be located where, and at what time. Why is it dangerous? Do people know? We are now putting up in Nairobi, we are putting up a highway between the airport and the central business district. Okay, and one of the things that the highway authorities said when we questioned them about quality of air because of the increased motorization, they said, no, we will plant trees to ensure that the emissions are absorbed. With that kind of thinking, obviously, the orientation and the mindset of those making decisions is already warped, and you can imagine now the long-term effects of that.
Thank you all. Let's move to the next question. And the first part of this question is for Rebecca and Kofi. When we talk about decolonization of science, as you said, we're asking for more work locally led by local experts. What is the relevance of international work on air pollution in the context in which you study? How critical is it? Has it been collaborative? What could be done better? And what is the role of international organizations? And here we mean funders, advocacy groups, campaigners, and how have they interacted with local groups? And do you have recommendations for how this could be improved in the future? Rebecca, perhaps we could start with you.
Yeah, thanks. I do think international work is very important, international collaborations, and I do think it is growing. And just one simple reason it's important, that even here in South Africa, we have for a sized field of researchers, but we're still tiny. We just can't answer all of the questions. We can't train students fast enough to answer all of the questions that there are. So even just for that, collaboration is really necessary when they're answering our questions. And that, that's what Kofi started with, our questions, not that we are being told what our questions are. And I think there have been some really good examples of this. And what comes to mind for me is the safari campaigns in South Africa. These were, air quality in South Africa. These are the seminal studies on air pollution and biomass burning. And it was a NASA and South African initiative. And I wasn't in South Africa at the time. It was in 2000 was the last campaign. But I hear stories of it, and I also see what has happened since then. The collaborators still work together. There's still a sense of community. The papers were written together. You can see even, 20 years now, right? There's still the linkages between people. And I've been told by, the older PIs, that was a conscious decision. They even wrote papers on the science diplomacy of the safari mission. It was they meant to do it that way. It was thought through, and it was just as important as the science. This is my reading of the situation, but seeing the positive aspects afterwards. But of course, there's probably many more examples of it not working. And for that, a lot of times it's when international researchers want us to be either their travel agents, or they come in with, I call it leading by capacity building, just assuming that a workshop on emission inventory development is all we need, and never asking, is capacity development what you need? And if it is, what do you need? Just leading with that. And that always, I think, sets a person off on the wrong foot. But even in those cases that there's well-intentioned collaborations and people want to work together, I think this is really driven by unequal funding. A lot of US, perhaps European researchers come in, they can only fund their side. So inherently, this is an unequal collaboration. And I don't know if really international researchers realize how financially constrained African researchers are. We can't just find money somewhere to support a collaboration with you. And this is something for the funders as well. And even the greater research community, I don't know the correct word for these types of activities, but it's just being part of the community, going to conferences, being on international working groups and assessments. As scientists, these are things we do have to do for our profile that we want to do. If we want to get African air quality into these things, we need to do it. We don't have funding for that, and it's a real constraint, and so our voices won't be at the table without that. With COVID, many conferences and even these assessments and such have gone virtual. So I really hope that at least helps a little bit, that we can now participate some with hybrid or virtual conferences and meetings and such. Some of the things I would like to see with this is, obviously we have to keep international collaborations. I would really like to see funders fund more projects with collaborations between African scientists. I think that we really can catalyze change if we do work together. Situations vary, but there's still also probably a lot of common problems that we can work on together. And there is research out there. There is work going on. There's great scientists. Why do I have to collaborate with someone in the US when, for epidemiology, I can work with Kofi instead? So that. And then also for, you know, I would also really like to see some of the past work, some of that information kind of come out more. And I think this is getting to a little bit what Constance said about opening up information. You know, we had before, this is a short story, but when we had the first meeting to scope out the idea for Anga, Andriana, who I think you're speaking with as well, at one point we were talking of how, you know, there is data out there, work exists, but where is it? And at one point she was just very exacerbated and she's like, where is the cook stove data? Where is this? And it's true, how long has cook stove research been happening in Africa? They must have so much information. Where is that information? And if you have scientists sitting around from a bunch of different countries, where is it? How can all of the information of all those studies that have come before not be open for us to use? And I think that's just, you know, what I want to leave on also is I do believe most of the time these projects do want to make a difference. They do want to have an impact. But to be honest, you know, after you leave, we see the impact. We talk with the policymakers who never wanted maybe what you're doing. You know, if you want to make an impact as an international organization, you have to work with the local researchers and all of the local stakeholders. Of course, as a researcher, that's through my view. But it will either, you know, not answer the questions that we have or not answer them in a way that might be helpful. Is a real risk that you run if you don't work together with the local researchers.
Thank you. Kofi, we'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, I think Rebecca has said it, or maybe what I want to do is just add up or touch on some areas that she hasn't highlighted. But I think the answer to your question is in the question. Yes, decolonization of science is all about letting local experts lead local research. But as I have already indicated, we need to also be very careful not to decolonize entirely because we have challenges here, real challenges. One of the real challenges is funding challenges. Not many African countries have funding schemes here, where you go to America, they have NIH. You go to the UK, they have NIHR. You go to Canada, they have. We don't have such mechanisms here. So we always have to look to the West, you know, for funding for research. And as I indicated, because we have challenges, because our capacity has not been way up there, we are not able to compete. And again, besides that, there's a lot of geopolitics involved, you know. If you apply for NIH fund from Africa, you need to have some American collaborators, you know, on it. So there is a lot of geopolitics. Just as in the publication of our research findings, there's so much geopolitics involved. So that is the more reason why international collaboration is very crucial to what we do here. I mean, for me, any proposal that I have, any grant proposal that I have written and I have submitted, I always look for collaborators from outside. And I do that tactfully. I don't mind sharing the information here. I do that tactfully because I know if I go solo, my chances of getting the grant is probably zero. But the moment I put somebody from the global north on the proposal, my chances could be 50, you know? So we need to find a balance. So not until governments here can have some funding schemes where we can assess and be able to do impactful research, I think colonization of science is going to live with us. Unfortunately, I have to say, it's going to live with us. And I think even for us researchers, in terms of building our capacity, we need them around so that we can continue to build our capacity and then eventually we'll wean ourselves off them, you know. So as Rebecca said, the role of international collaboration is very, very crucial to whatever we do here. And now in science, the focus is on collaborative research, as I indicated in my earlier submission. So that is very crucial. And we need to find a way. I think in all this, my proposal is simple, that we need to find a way to get government in Africa to understand that science is what drives policy. Maybe that is not a message that they get. Because if you realize that most of the problems that we are being bedeviled here on our continent, i.e. malaria, tuberculosis, environmental pollution, air pollution, whatever. I mean, all these things, we need some evidence, we need science to show. And that is what can drive policy. And once they realize that science is what will drive policy, then of course, they're going to put the money in there, and then we can assess the funds and we'll be able to do impactful research. And I think one thing that Rebecca said, and I want to end on that, is that we don't even have the fund to bring them down here to come and collaborate with us. And even getting folks here to even attend scientific conferences is a challenge. I mean, I know in universities out there, you can apply to your university somewhere to get some fund. They have grants which they can rely on to travel. Yeah, it's a challenge. And those conferences, scientific conferences, is where we get to see cutting edge research, where we get to meet people to collaborate, you know. So if you are not able to attend scientific conferences, then of course, at some point, you're going to be very rusty, you know. So there's a lot of challenges that we are faced here, and it's getting in the way of trying to do good quality research. And by extension, that is the reason why we still have so many public health problems that are still around. We are not able to solve them because we are not able to do good quality science by virtue of our limitations to be able to impact policy and solve those challenges. Yeah.
Thank you.
I did want to say that, you know, that there is a lot of great international collaborations going on despite all of this very I felt like we brought up a lot of the difficulties. And as I was thinking back to what I said, you know, there's a lot of people trying to work on this. And I think there's a lot of really good international collaborations. And if there's just one piece of information, is that funders really need to start supporting African researchers and African people working in this, so it can be equal. Because I mean, our collaborators, I have some similar collaborators as Kofi. I think everyone's trying to make this very equal, but it's just very hard.
I think like the funding piece was the one that really came out in all of your discussions, and you did touch on some great collaborations, which I think are important, so that like everyone else can learn from, you know, what happened in the Safari campaign. But thank you. For Constant and Noémi, is science enough to clean up air pollution? What are the biggest limiting factors to achieving reductions in pollution right now, in your opinion? And how can scientists work with, what kinds of collaborations do we need with geographers, urban planners, social scientists, lawyers to bring about change? And what is holding such collaborations back? Can existing organizational frameworks / institutions support such interdisciplinary work? And what are the data infrastructures we need to facilitate the science that is being carried out so that it is used effectively? And for Constant, I also would love for you to tell us more about the role of citizen science in pushing for policy action on air pollution. Constant, maybe we could start with you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, you know, it's very interesting that Rebecca mentioned, you know, cookstove data, and that we have many people who've collected a lot of cookstove data out there. And, you know, I find that interesting because it's almost in every sector that we have people who've collected loads of data, but we're just here waiting and looking for it. And science is very important. Okay, and let's not put that aside. It's very important, you know, to clean up air pollution, or in literally every other sector. You know, it gives us an opportunity to bring out points of view that cannot really be questioned by opinions. Okay, because it's very easy for, you know, political opinions to get the way. But of course, it cannot just stand on its own. It has a very critical role, but there are many other disciplines that can come together with it. One of the most interesting experiences, you know, we've seen in the environmental sector has been how investigative journalism has come in to work with science. Okay, if you check in Kenya, we've had Africa Uncensored, which is a media organization that does a lot of investigative journalism, and you know, they've been able to look through some, you know, critical environmental issues and bring out the stories. Because when you have the information, or you have that data, what do you do with it? You need somebody to bring it out. The same role is played by bloggers, and I can speak out as somebody who's done a lot of blogging over the years, and blogging also plays that role in bringing out that aspect of scientific data, because science plays a very critical role, in providing proof of evidence of the existing situation. But there's need for it to come out. But on top of all that, there's one thing we cannot run away from, which is good governance. Whether we can have all the laws we want, we can have all the data we want, we can have all the information. If we don't have good governance, then there's really no game we're playing. The recent incident we had in the neighborhood of Syokimau in just on the outskirts of Nairobi, where Code for Africa was able to work with with local journalists to bring out a story on air pollution in a neighborhood, to a point where the governor of that particular county, in some places you may call that a state, in other places a province, but the governor of that county ended up having to go to speak on the media. And that's what you want, and that's the role you want. You want, that sense of accountability, people to ask questions. Okay, and this, will lead me to, to your next question, which is what is the biggest limiting factor? What are the biggest limiting factors? And we go back to the role of governance. Okay. Governance is a critical factor in from a planning perspective. We may talk about the importance of we have the 4 paradigms of in planning. We have physical infrastructure, its importance. We have economic prosperity. We have social equity. But those 3 cannot stand without good governance. Okay, it's like a three-legged stool, and then governance is the top of the stool. Without it, the other 3 aspects do not exist. And the same comes out in pollution, because we can have all the information, we can say all the things we want, but if the people making the decisions, are playing cat and mouse games, which is unfortunately what we've seen a lot on our continent, then it leaves us at them, literally at their mercy. What role can we play with collaborations between geographers, planners, social scientists, and the rest? I think we've begun to see that coming in. When we start seeing journalists coming in, when we start seeing lawyers coming into the picture. I know we're talking about air pollution, but I've also been involved in a big campaign for a couple of years on noise pollution, which is a problem which is a bit of an urban problem, where you have nightclubs forming next to residential areas, and then you get a lot of you get that in collaboration between, you get social scientists coming in, lawyers coming in, and the same applies with air pollution, where now you try to look for other professionals to come and bring out, the dangers of pollution, that, the dangers of pollution that pollution has on children. The social scientists and the medical practitioners play a very big role there. The dangers of bad urban land use management, the urban planners and urban geographers come into there. And then when at times you have to take hard action, which is, filing suits against the authorities, the legal profession and fraternity comes. It's unfortunate that many times, because of bad governance, we have to go in that direction. It's very, very sad. A big challenge, we have in this part of the world, as I mentioned, about the highway, earlier on as I was speaking, is the silo perspective you have in different departments, especially in the public sector. So you may have the environment department that is functioning totally detached from the planning department, which is functioning very detached from the transport department, and yet all these 3 are completely interrelated. They should not be, operating independently. In fact, they should be interacting more than anything else on a daily basis. And these problems in public sectors, be it at municipal level, city level, or at national level, are some of the reasons why we are ending up precisely where we are with, all these unfortunate incidences of many people being victims of pollution. Fortunately, we do have a lot of I would say private sector academia coming to try to create some influence, and we've had some very successful, a couple, some very good stories, at least, of creating awareness, where people have been able to create awareness within informal settlements of the importance of indoor air pollution, where local residents are involved within that particular research, which adds up to your other question of what's the role of citizen science. The role of citizen science comes and plays a very important role of involving people in understanding precisely what they're facing. So we don't have the situation where some group of researchers have come in from whatever part of the world or from whatever local university, they come, collect their data and go away. No, we have a situation where the actual people with the monitors collecting the data are those people from the particular community. And that has been attempted a bit. I've seen an attempt within informal settlements in Nairobi. We've seen an attempt within the transport sector in Nairobi, and that has slowly started building up and creating a bit of much more awareness among them, because then they ask to see the results, and when they get to see the scale, the AQI scale, and are able to say, okay, so this is what we are breathing. Yes, this is what you're breathing. Why? And you explain to them why. Then you start getting people making conscious decisions, and demanding better circumstances. There's still a lot that needs to be done, of course. First of all, creating awareness. The governance problem is a much bigger problem beyond, the scale of this discussion, as well as, just sharing that the information and the impacts that we have. If, for instance, and maybe you can correct me for using this example, if we had the kind of information out there that we see on HIV/AIDS on the continent being put out on air pollution related and respiratory related illnesses, we would definitely get to see that kind of change. When they were redoing the education syllabus in Kenya about 10, 15 years ago, they talked about emerging factors. But their main emerging factor was around HIV/AIDS and population issues. Okay, they didn't really put emphasis on environmental issues, which we know are a critical issue. So we have to see it being put at the forefront at all these levels.
Thank you, Constant. Noémi?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, science is, again, crucial, but never enough by itself. I mean, I think we need politics at every step, from deciding what kind of science is needed to how it's going to be done to how the results are going to be used and communicated and shared. And for this to happen, we need to make sort of this space of political debate visible and open, so that kind of also non-scientists and just as many people who have a stake in sort of making exposure science happen, participate in that debate. And I think activism is crucial here to kind of claim a right to participating in the debate, but I think in a lot of contexts, we can't also wait for activism necessarily to emerge, because there's a real problem in terms of distribution of information. I mean, I think certainly in Senegal, there's no investigative science and health journalism at all. And there's not really much kind of explanatory pedagogical science journalism either. So what you get in the newspaper is basically a rehash of whatever's happened at some seminar and what, the speech that was given to open the seminar. So it's really always the kind of government official view, and there's no space of reflection around these issues that happens through it. And the kind of investigative journalism that has happened that's been really interesting tends to be French journalists coming in or British journalists coming in, whose work then gets kind of rediffused outside. So you'll get a better sense of what the kind of issues on the ground are from reading the BBC or RFI than you do from reading Senegalese newspapers. So there are sort of constraints at every level, including also on government's issues. So, the ways in which governments are constrained and what they can offer in terms of possibilities for economic growth, in terms of how they can kind of create political kind of currency through distributing favors. I mean, there's a huge amount of literature on kind of African politics, which takes into account these global structural issues, which also needs to be taken into account to understand how a kind of, to come back to Senegal, the kind of emergence plan, why it happens the way it does, and why, and what's the wiggle room, what are the margins for sort of contestation and questioning around that. So yeah, I think, I mean, we need social scholarship of science itself to kind of expose science as being a political from the outset and always already political, and how that means we need to make that, not make science non-political, but make the politics of science more democratic. And then all kinds of other scholarship, which I think are particularly important in these settings where there's a sort of absence of journalism education around pollution issues, which can kind of bring in voices into the debate through ethnographic study of how people experience polluted environments, what their concerns are, sort of bring that in through mediation, again, as an intermediary step until there is more kind of grassroots activism happening, and more sort of bringing governments, taking them to accountability, which is important. But I think there's a kind of all these kind of mediations that need to happen as well. And in terms of constraints on collaboration, I think we come back time and again to the issue of lack of funding. I think if you know, specific exposure scientists, natural scientists have to go to northern collaborations to fund their science, they're not necessarily, they don't have the time or space or freedom to go towards the anthropology department right next to them, or to go towards you know, having funding for, you know, impact and sort of communicating their results to the public, or speaking, you know, being involved with activist groups. And I think you know, there's a cascading effect of that lack of means and lack of sovereignty in terms of practicing the science itself.
Thank you. And this is our last question before we move into, you know, final remarks and discussion. We would love to hear everyone's thoughts on what environmental justice in terms of air pollution means in the context in which you work. And how can scientific research and other collaborations help to highlight the inequities in exposure to air pollution and the associated effects at different geographic scales? Perhaps in this round, maybe we could start with Noémi.
I think I probably have the least to say here, but I'll just give a small example of what it might look like. And again, the kind of cross-sectional types of knowledge and collaborations you might need. So, I mean, I noticed that a recent study about looking at indoor and outdoor air pollution exposure in Dakar really highlighted how women working inside the household are the most exposed. So because of the multiple forms of pollutants that they're exposed to. And so that would be the kind of finding on which you might build a coalition that looks at, you know, gender roles, gender inequities, who spends time where, the conditions under which kind of household labor is distributed, systems of kind of labor migration. You know, there are all kinds of issues that bundle into the condition of particular women working either in their own households or as hired labor for others that will contribute to why they're more vulnerable to exposure. So I think that's just as an example of the kind of points at which environmental justice can start being thought out. That's all I'm going to say. I'm really interested to hear what others have to say.
Thank you. Constance, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think from a point of view of environmental justice, the first thing I would think about are vulnerable groups who don't really get the environment, to live in the environment they deserve. Starting, of course, with first of all, people in informal settlements. Okay, having first of all more awareness of the dangers about the environment they deserve, and also having policy being driven in a way that gives them more fundamental rights. For example, people who, in many of the informal settlements you'll find are located next to certain industries, and those in the industries don't really care about pollutants and will release pollutants whenever they wish. So the first thing I think I would think about is that, how can those vulnerable groups, especially the urban poor, get that kind of justice? The second group I would think about, again, thinking, from a vulnerability perspective, are the unseen groups who get a lot of, who get affected a lot, but never get highlighted. Good examples are people in the transport sector. Okay, and the transport sector, we're talking first of all traffic police who spend hours and hours managing traffic, but nobody really asks. Although I understand we are beginning to get a few people asking this question, but how much are these traffic officers affected by air pollution, considering that they spend up to 10, 12 hours, exposed to all those vehicular fumes? Workers within the public transport sector who obviously spend their time a lot of their time on the road, exposed to all these vehicular emissions. And then people at household level, and Noémi has mentioned, people at women at household level who we don't necessarily, who at times we just create, we assume many times, even in the rural areas, that no, they are okay. They may be using, they're using, biofuels, and then we assume that, the assumption many times is that because the cooking is done outside, then it is okay. Okay, and much more awareness among those people of the dangers, they are all exposed to, and seeing some action or actionable policy being taken in order to be able to assist these people.
Thank you. Kofi?
Yeah, so what does environmental justice means to me in terms of the work I do and how I see things, in my settings here. So in simple terms, it's inequities in clean air. It's as simple as ABCD. If you look in the neighborhoods where we find ourselves, there are some neighborhoods where the air is clean, it's much greener, whereas if you go to slum areas and low-income neighborhoods, the air there is polluted, the environment there in itself is polluted. What are the causes? There are several causes for this. I will start with neocolonialism. We have been colonized again, You look at how some foreign governments, are back on the continent trying to pilfer the country in terms of resources. Looking for earth resources, gold, setting up industries here and there, which is not beneficial to the folks. All they are doing is polluting the environment. So that is one of the causes. So you see a lot of injustices as it relates to environment there. And governments in itself here are perpetuating this fraud on us, one way or the other, because they are all over the place trying to look for financial resources to improve the economy, to expand the economy, without looking at the consequences that this brings to us, So if we want to stay on air pollution, how are we trying to address environmental justice by virtue of the work that we do over here? If you look at our Ghana Urban Air Quality Project, it's one way of trying to address inequities in air quality in urban Ghana. Because as I indicated in my initial submission, we don't have air quality monitors in the country. The only air quality monitors that we have, that is regulatory grade monitors, are in Accra. And even that, they are very old, they are obsolete. They keep on breaking down. So there are several days where there is missing data. So the data in essence is useless. The data is also not open access. So if I live in Accra, I don't even know what the air pollution level is today. You can't access the data. And even as researchers, we want to assess the data for health effect studies. We can't. You have to go and pay. I think the other time I was on a call with Rebecca, and the the program officer from our Ghana EPA. In fact, we had a banter on that. And he was very emphatic that we can't have the data for free. And I was excited that he indicated this on a global platform, you know. So that tells you that if we don't have access to the data, how are we going to be able to generate some evidence to go and address environmental justice? And that is the reason why we have this Ghana Urban Air Pollution Air Quality Project, which hopes to deploy low-cost sensors. And in recent times, we are even getting some regulatory equipment from the UK to support our effort here. And that way, we can have open access air quality data. So if you're in your neighborhood and you have a kid who is suffering from asthma, I mean, you can know the air pollution levels and advise yourself, you know, and so that it doesn't exacerbate the condition. So in a way, we are also trying to address the problems here. Another aspect, in a very subtle way too, through our research work, we are also in a way trying to address environmental justice by way of air pollution, because the mainstay of our work is on household air pollution health effects. So that is what we do. I mean, people are using in Africa here, you know, about 80% of households are using charcoal, wood, and other biomass fuels to cook, and it generates a lot of smoke in the household. And especially the reason why I'm particularly interested in maternal women, mothers, and their children is that you have here traditionally the woman will have to cook for the family, and even if the woman is pregnant, throughout the duration of pregnancy, she still has to go to the kitchen and cook. And possibly too, she has one child carrying at the back and they'll be in the kitchen. So while she is inhaling all this combustion pollutant, the child is also inhaling all these things, you know. And ignorance is part of it. And again, they don't even know the adverse effects of these things. So one way or the other, when we try to do research and try to quantify household air pollution and how it impacts maternal health outcome, then we can do some community advocacy. And by being able to do that, we are in a way also trying to address environmental justice as it relates to air pollution. So in brief, that is what it means. That are some of the causes. And then again, the solutions is what you have. But finally, at the government level, these things should be addressed. We could address air pollution in very small ways, you know. What does it take for government to extend LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, to all households nationwide? It doesn't take anything. You just have to extend the production, expand production facilities, and then also expand the networks so that families do not have to travel 5 kilometers to go and buy LPG, which is a clean fuel to use. That is a disincentive. If I have to travel 5 kilometers to go and buy clean fuel, I will not. I'll rather use biomass fuel to cook. Again, we can find a way to address air pollution in urban areas. What does it take? All it takes is to try to step up non-motorized transport by virtue of trying to have a lot of bicycle lanes. In Kenya, they are doing well by doing that, having a lot of bicycle lanes so that we can cycle to work, we can walk to work. And again, the mass transit systems we have here are not reliable. I mean, in Europe and America, if you have to start work in the next 20 minutes, I know when I get to the bus stop, the next bus arrives in 5 minutes. Here, we don't have it that way. And that is the more reason why everybody is trying to buy a vehicle and drive to work. But if we can find a way to get the buses to be very reliable, then of course, everybody will jump on it. But I think I've said this somewhere in a workshop, that the key to joining a public bus is, are you going to get a very sophisticated businessman to sit in the public bus with market women? That is also a key question. You know, how do we get a sophisticated city worker to sit in a public transport to go to work in the city in Africa here? It's a dilemma that we also have to think about. So the solutions are simple, but to the politician is very complex. So that's about it. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca, you have the last word because we'll probably run out of time.
Okay, thanks. I have I think just a short comment. It's already, a lot's been said by all the other panel members. I think environmental justice is the core of our work. It should be the core of our work. It probably isn't all the time. It isn't all the time. And that I mean in the greater sense as well, air quality just in general. We know that there is air inequality and that we have to focus on improving the air pollution for the most vulnerable. And I think from a regulatory point of view, it's many times much more difficult. You know, here in South Africa, we have a lot of focus on the big industry emitters. And of course, we must have minimum emission standards. They must be enforced. But that's quite easy compared to the domestic burning, waste burning, dirt roads, everything else, you know, the community-based, even vehicles really in these large cities. These are really hard problems that we can't we have to start thinking about. We have to come up with solutions for them, really. And that, you know, who lives near the roads, who has to use solid fuels, that is an environmental justice issue, I think, right there. And for the scientists, what is our role? You know, I think that we've all been saying it in this. It's scientists and collaborators, we want information public. You know, getting this information out there is one of our key roles, I think, in trying to advocate for clean air. And then finally, on this idea of the different geographical scales, I was just thinking that, you know, we can't presume that we understand the air pollution in different settings. You know, it doesn't necessarily follow that rural areas are always going to be cleaner than urban areas, because that's the case perhaps in Europe or in the US. You know, that there are very different sources and very different, you know, mixes of sources as well.
Thank you all so much. I mean, this was incredible. Thank you all for, you know, for making the time to do this, because I have learned so much, and I think this is going to be a really, really important conversation to have out there.
So thank you all for a really engaging discussion. I think what I'm taking away from this is that decolonizing science requires that we think not only about the way the science is done and what we study, it's also about the institutions that enable it, from local to national governments to international development organizations, and even research partnerships. There are power dynamics at play that ultimately shape the information that is produced and shared. And this is going to be really important to think about going forward. So thank you all for laying this out so clearly, and thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of Decolonizing Science. This is CoLab Radio, and signing off.